And after we mince our garlic, we put our chicken in the oven on 425 degrees, and while that's cooking, we'll check our potatoes. Margaret's smile felt plastered on, and she could feel her makeup running under the studio lights. She was cooking for a crowd of about 100, most of them on their phones, with probably less than 1,000 paying attention at home. She knew how fortunate she was to get this spot on Channel 12's Something Cookin' segment, but it had barely changed her situation at all. The extra money was nice, but all it really meant was that she had to go to Salome's fine dining at 2 p.m. instead of noon on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She'd been excited at first, hoping someone from a big network might see her, but after 2 years of the segment, it really hadn't amounted to much. "Oh yeah, just look at those potatoes," she said, holding up a bowl for the audience. "Now we'll just give them an injection from today's sponsor." She gritted her teeth as she presented the injector like a game show host presenting prizes. "Archibald Forrest's Hot Cheese Injector. With Archibald Forrest, you can be sure that your family is getting 100% American-made cheese from right here in the heartland. Archibald Forrest, a name you can trust." She slid the needle into the potatoes and injected the soft spuds with sauce. They bulged a little, the cheese oozing out as she slid the needle free. It was enough to make her skin crawl. She hated these cheese injectors, mostly because they made her think of the big needles she had looked at when she was a kid. She had a lifelong fear of needles, and this wasn't doing it any favors. She was glad when the set person took the tray away, the gleaming chrome injectors making her teeth chatter. She kept her smile in place, though, not wanting to appear rattled by a little thing like needles. Now, those potatoes can go into the oven for 20 minutes, and that should give our chicken a chance to get nice and brown. While that cooks, let's talk a little more about today's sponsor. Archibald Forrest is a cheese company you can trust. For over 50 years, they've been providing quality cheese to the... She fell into the paid segment easily, her mind not on cheese. Her mind was on one of the only two people actually listening to her. They kind of stood out amongst the sea of phones and watchers and bored faces. They wore a suit like an undertaker's, the handkerchief sticking out at the throat of the taller one, looking garish. It was all that looked garish about him, too. While the young one appeared vibrant, his dark skin nearly making him blend into the dimmed house lights. The man beside him looked like a corpse. His skin was pale, his hair fine and platinum, and his smile was too big. She was afraid that it would cut his head in half and send it falling into the seats in front of him at any minute, and their attention caused her to stutter more than once over the product placement. The timer went off behind her as she spoke, and she was glad to turn away as she went to take the potatoes out. "Look at those beauties! Bursting with flavor and ready for your table. Everyone here today will be getting a complimentary sample of Archibald Forrest's Hot Cheese Injector, a $25 gift, yours free today for watching this segment in studio." The lights for applause came on, and they put their phones down long enough to clap half-heartedly. The old corpse's hands sounded like bones coming together as he clapped for her, too. She kept smiling as the lights baked her, and when she invited the cameras to return to the studio, she sagged in the lights when they went up. She set the potatoes down a little harder than she strictly needed to, and walked off set in a flurry of apron and no-slip shoes. She had to get out of the sight of those two, the corpse especially. They had both been interested in her, but the eyes of the old guy had been downright predatory. "Great show today, Mags," JD said, coming around to catch her up. She raised an eyebrow at him, not sure why he was here. Jamie Darling was her agent, and he wasn't a very good one. He'd got her this gig and a few guest spots on other cooking shows. That was about all he had managed in her 10-year career as a semi-celebrity chef. You just don't have brand recognition, Mags. One of these days you'll get there. Till then, just put your time in, he'd always say. Please tell me you have something, she said as she headed for the dressing room. Her dressing room had started life as a broom closet, and Maggie could still smell the cleaners that had once lived here. She stopped outside, knowing they would be nose to nose if she invited him in. That was a little more intimate than she wanted to be with Jamie Darling, and they both knew it. I do, as it happens. His smile was nearly as large as the ghoul's had been, and he seemed quite happy with himself. I got you a spot in the preliminaries for the Food Network's new chef showcase. It's no Iron Chef, but it's a place for chefs to make a name for themselves, and they agreed to accept an audition tape from a one Margaret Schaefer. Maggie had to admit that was pretty good, and the hug she threw on JD was legitimate. Oh my God, JD, this is huge. This is how guys like Emerald got their start. If I could do well here, I could leverage this into a line of cookware, or a show on the Food Network, or a spot at a celebrity restaurant, or even pump the brakes, shooting star, JD said, laughing at her excitement. It's just an audition. There's some serious competition here, but I think you got a good shot. These are mostly no-name chefs, guys who are cooking short-order stuff or catering kids' parties. You helped Salome earn that Michelin star that she's so proud of showing off, and I know you can wow the judges here, too. Maggie smiled. Thanks, JD. When's the tape due? He sucked air through his teeth. That's the bad news. It's got to be in by Sunday to qualify. Maggie's anger flashed up like a grease fire. Sunday? That's only 3 days. I don't know what I'm going to cook. I don't have any ingredients. I don't. JD put a hand on her shoulder. Don't sweat the I don'ts. You figure out what you need, and I'll get the supplies. You can pay me back when you're a big star, right? He said with a wink. She nodded. Okay, I'll figure it out tonight and send you a list. We can do this. I know we can. She reached into the dressing room and grabbed the hanger for her apron, taking off her cook's whites too, and trading them for the grease-stained ones she wore at Salome's. Now, however, I need to get to work. Till I'm famous, I've still got bills to pay. I need 2 steaks for table 2, potatoes au gratin and asparagus. Yes, chef. Maggie directed the kitchen as her brain ran in overdrive. House salad and Catalina for table 7. Oysters and clams. Table 6 is going out now. Something with pork or beef, she thought, as she chopped vegetables and prepared broths. I need a lamb and rice for table 9 and a porterhouse medium for table 9. Broccoli spears and mashed potatoes. Yes, chef. She had decided on pork as she went into the middle of the dinner rush and was constructing her ingredients when she saw the two enter the restaurant. She was standing in the door of the kitchen, watching the food go out as she caught her breath before going to prep the beef for the next rush. She saw them walk in and take a table near the wall, finding menus and bending over them studiously. Even bent over that plastic rectangle, she could still feel him looking at her. He was peeking, side-eyed from across the glossy surface of today's specials, and she shuddered as she ducked back into the kitchen. A few minutes later, Gabriella came back in with their order. Be careful with these, she said, her voice low and a little afraid. I think that guy at table 16 might be a food critic. He makes jokes and smiles a lot, but he just has an aura about him. I don't like it. They want 2 porterhouses, potatoes au gratin, and broccoli. How do they want their steaks? Maggie asked, patting Dave as she took his place on the grill. If this was a critic, she wanted to get out in front of this, so he'd have the best food and the most expertise possible. The younger guy wants his medium, but the other guy, he wants his steak rare. Maggie shuddered, but here at Salome's, the customer was always right, and it was hard to mess up a rare steak. 20 minutes later, Maggie took the plates out herself, telling Gabrielle that she would take them to the table. To her surprise, Gabrielle seemed relieved. Thank God. Every time I go to refill their drinks, that guy's eyes creep me out. His smile looks unnatural. She closed her eyes as if trying to find the right words, and she finally settled on that one. McGhee took the plates out to the pair, and when she sat them down on the polished wooden surface, the man with the strange eyes looked up at her expectantly. "I don't like being hounded, gentlemen. I assume that's why you followed me here. So why don't you tell me what this is all about?" The skeletal man looked at her, his smile growing wide as he turned back to the dark youth. "My name is Richard T. Sereph, and this is Lucifer Jones, my assistant. Pay no attention to him, however. He's learning the trade and is mostly here to observe. The reason I've come here today is to talk about selling your talent." McGhee looked at him oddly. My talent?" Mr. Sereph indicated an empty chair at the table, and McGhee took it, keeping a safe distance from the pair. They were like bookends, a pair of undertakers out on the town, and had he just said that boy's name was Lucifer? Who would saddle someone with a name like that? Clearly not this one. He was wide enough to be the father of Snow. They did make an interesting contrast, however, and McGhee was interested to know why they were following her. "Yes, your talent," he said, taking a business card out of his coat. "Libris Talent is looking for all kinds of talent these days, and yours would be a fine addition to our growing catalog." This wasn't quite what she had expected. She had expected a fan. God knew she had enough letters in the studio, but this sounded more like another agent's attempt to scalp her for their agency. She had heard of things like that happening, but she thought it was something that only happened in movies. Surely they weren't here for her, but what if this was her big shot? "Okay, so what exactly are you guys? Are you talent agents or something?" "You could say that," Mr. Sereph said. "Our business is talent. We pay people for the talent they may not be utilizing to its fullest extent." "People like me?" she asked, bristling a little at the comment. "You think I'm wasting my talent? Is that what you're saying?" Lucifer smirked a little, looking away from Mr. Sereph to hide it. Clearly he thought his boss had erred. "We see that you are using it to the extent of your abilities, but it could be better served. Let us pay you for it," and she stood up, the man cutting himself off abruptly as he glanced up at her. "I think we're done here. I have orders backing up in the kitchen, and I need to get back to work." His hand came out quick enough that she was worried he would hurt her, but in between his fingers was a business card. "In case you change your mind, the value of your talent is on the back. Just something to think about." McGhee wanted to walk away, but she found herself taking the card and putting it in her pocket. You should eat those while they're hot. Once they get cold, the taste is wasted." Then she turned and went back to the kitchen. They left some time later, returning nothing, but McGhee had put the enigmatic Mr. Sereph out of her mind for now. She had decided on her dish, and as she left for the night, she was already texting JD a list of things that she would need. If she was going to be ready, she was going to need everything to be perfect. And as it comes out of the oven, we see the magnificent fruits of our labor. The crown roast is perfectly crisp and ready to serve. She flashed a smile that was anything but pasted on this evening, and as she signed off, JD clapped in that slow, deliberate way of his. "If they don't accept you after that, then they are utter fools. Think I can get a taste of that crown roast? It was all I could do not to yank it out of the oven early." McGhee grabbed a knife, plating some of it so JD could try. It was a good recipe, easy to make, but worth a decent price at some upscale restaurants. Hopefully it would impress the judges enough to secure her a spot in the contestant pool. As she tried a little bit of it for herself, even she was impressed with how it had come out. You cook like this on the show?" JD said through a mouthful of meat. "And you're a shoo-in for the top spot." "I hope so," she said, thinking about what winning something like this could mean for her. She wondered suddenly if she should tell JD about Mr. Sereph. Would he be mad at the man for making such an offer? Would he call him up and tell him that he had her under contract? She didn't know, but she guessed that he wouldn't be very happy, and she didn't want to spoil the mood. "I know so," he said. "Your cooking is next level, Mags. I think you'll be hearing back from them once I send them this tape." "That's what you said about the cook-off last year, though," Maggie said, remembering her third-place trophy. "That was a total snatch job. I'm telling you, that lady had to have known someone. Your brisket chili was the best one there. I should know. I sampled all of them. Tasted like she was using plain ground beef with no style or substance. This is different. This is the chance you've been waiting for." Maggie nodded, putting her past failures out of her mind. This was going to be her moment. "Okay, let's take this home and polish it up a little. I want it to look amazing when I send it off." "Not too much," she hedged, knowing JD's habit for going overboard. "It's just a cooking video. It doesn't need too much polish." He waved a hand at her. "Don't worry, I'll get their attention. Mark my words, they won't be able to ignore this video." He left shortly after that, and Maggie hoped he was right. Maggie really wanted this to be her moment. JD sent the video off Saturday afternoon, and Maggie was a nervous wreck all of Sunday. She could be seen running the kitchen from the back of house, chain smoking by the back door as she glanced at her cell phone. They wouldn't render a decision this soon. It would probably be next week, and she just knew that she'd be on pins and needles the whole time. Monday came, and Monday went. Tuesday saw her regretting making the video in the first place. What business did she have making a video for something like this? She was no master chef. They would see that, and they would pass her over. No, JD had been right. This was her chance. She needed to stay positive. She was going to make it. She was going to be on the show. She was going to take her shot. As she sat drinking wine in her apartment after work, she looked at the business card that she had left on the coffee table. Libris Talent was printed across the front in bold black letters, with Richard T. Sereph printed below it. She had honestly forgotten it until she reached into her pocket for some change on Monday night. She left it on the table, not really wanting to touch it. She hadn't looked at the other side. She didn't want to know what the offer was. JD was doing okay by her, and she just needed to stay the course. By Wednesday, she was ready to chew nails and make staples. She was dreading Thursday as she got ready for bed on Wednesday. How was she going to cook for an audience with this hanging over her head? It was Summerfest tomorrow, and she'd be making mostly sides to go with her Hawaiian burgers. The sponsor was Sweet Hickory Barbecue Sauce, and she already knew that it would clash with the taste she was going for. Didn't matter, though. They had paid for the spot, so their sauce would be going into the marinade. She was brushing her teeth when someone knocked on her door, and she could see JD looking contrite as he stood on the front porch. She opened it slowly, curious to know what he was doing here so late. "Just figured I'd give you the news in person," he said, sounding a little disappointed. He was shuffling around like a cartoon character, and it would have been funny if the news didn't seem so dire. "Well, out with it, darling," she said, putting her hands on her hips. The mischievous smile that broke her lips told her all she needed to know as the clouds parted and his smile was once again radiant. "They loved your submission. They want you on set next Tuesday." Suddenly they were both dancing around like a couple of girls at a sleepover, and Maggie's fears and megrims had melted away. "You might want to tell Channel 12 that they need an alternate, because it sounds like you're going to be busy for the next few weeks." She realized he was right and decided to type up a little something to give the stage manager tomorrow when she got there. It was short notice, and they probably wouldn't like it, but she knew that they would support it. If she came back and picked up the segment again, it would do wonders for viewership. Even if she lost and was forced to return to her normal existence, people would watch to see the woman that had been on the chef showcase. She said goodnight to JD, thanking him for all his help, and when she turned in that night, she had a polite letter of intention typed up and let them know that she might need someone to take over her Thursday spot. She dreamed of winning it all that night as she drifted off, but as she cooked for the celebrity judges, there was the ever-present shadow of the smiling man in the black suit. He watched from the audience, his eyes boring into her, and in her dreams it made her clumsy. She dropped things, she spilled broth, she cut her finger with a knife as she chopped vegetables, and her happy dream became a nightmare. She woke up in a cold sweat, promising herself it wouldn't be like that. Next Tuesday would be her time to shine. She was all a-quiver as she stood beside the other 12 contestants for the first stage of Chef's Showcase. It was Thursday, and she just knew that Mary Schuyler, the girl who got to run the cooking segment when she was out, was bungling through the handmade crab rangoons they were making today. When she had announced it at the end of the last episode, the audience had actually stood up and applauded. There had been no grinning specters in that audience, and her contemporaries on the network had wished her well in the competition. Management hadn't been terribly happy with her, but she had agreed to wear the Channel 12's apron with something cooking emblazoned on it, and that soothed them a little bit. They had agreed to let her out of her contract for the length of the contest, but made it clear that they would expect her to fulfill her contractual obligations when she returned, no matter the outcome. Tuesday had been all about shooting promos at the backstory part of the show. She had talked about cooking with her mother and her grandmother when she was young, cooking her way through culinary arts school, losing her grandmother before graduation, and then getting on with Salome's and helping them succeed. It was a beautiful story, not as tear-jerking as some, but still pretty sympathetic. Now they all stood together, ready to be set to their tasks as the host, Conrad Beasley, introduced the panel of judges. All three were well-known chefs, but Maggie was more concerned with what the first dish would be. "Your first challenge, chefs, will be," and as he yanked the cloth back, Maggie let out a sigh of relief, "lamb. You'll have your choice of veggies from the garden box and 60 minutes on the clock. The theme for this dish will be backyard barbecue. And begin." Maggie scampered to get the ingredients along with the rest. Backyard barbecue, she thought, as she grabbed the greens and the tomatoes. Maybe a chutney or some lamb cut thick and served as steak. She was picking up onions when she thought about a burger, and the recipe came together in her mind. Before she knew it, she was grinding the meat into patties, cutting potatoes for fries, and getting everything ready for plating. The burgers cooked up quickly, the cheese melting and the onions caramelizing, and as the ingredients came together, Maggie found herself glancing up at the audience. She was terrified that she would see him there. She had seen him in her dreams for the past 4 nights, but that didn't mean that he would be there. He wasn't following her. She knew it was all nerves. She heard something pop in the pan and realized her medium rare burgers were edging towards medium. She pulled them out and plated them, looking up to find that she had about 15 minutes left before the presentation. She put the fries in, plating the burgers before working on presentation. She added a toothpick, but took it out. She weighed the options between sesame buns and regular, and ultimately decided on seedless buns. The fries came out just as the clock hit 5 minutes, and Maggie had plenty of time to get them plated before time was called. She smiled at her food, standing at the ready as she watched the host. She was still watching the host when she saw something move in the gallery where the audience sat. It was a shadow, nothing too out there, but when it moved, it drew her eye. It was moving between the people, it seemed, the shadowy audience looking strange as they waited in hushed anticipation. They had called the first contestant, but she couldn't focus on whatever he was talking about. It was as if the whatever it was had been moving to get a better vantage point. It was as if it were moving to see her better, and as she stood sweating in her cook's whites, she could feel those familiar eyes on her. "Let's welcome our next chef, Margaret Schaefer, to the stage with her lamb burgers." Maggie felt her teeth chatter as she watched the shadow, not sure what it was, but knowing who it was. "Margaret!" She snapped back, nearly stumbling as she turned to the host. "Would you like to show us what you've made?" Maggie glanced back at the audience, but the shadow was gone. "Yes, it's my take on lamb chutney. It's a medium-rare lamb burger with oven fries and a..." But as she walked, she happened to look up. He was standing up now, grinning down at her with his too big grin, and she did trip this time. The trip was a good cover for her shriek, but the food was not so lucky. She caught 2 of the plates, the third going right into the lap of the middle judge, Chef Randolph McManus. He grimaced, looking at the mess in his lap, and suddenly her eyes were full of tears. Shit! She had messed it all up. This was it. There was no coming back from this. Not only that, but she only had 2 plates of food to offer now. She would fail the challenge, no matter what she said. Excuse me," she sobbed, running off stage before anyone could stop her. She was running all the way to the green room, but that didn't seem far enough. Before she knew it, she was in her car, crying into her steering wheel. She'd blown it. She couldn't go back to a TV spot either, because dollars to donuts, this would all go viral by tomorrow. Some stagehand or some audience member would have gotten the whole thing, and before she went to bed tonight, there would be memes and tweets that had been turned into clips on TikTok with the most unflattering music they could find. She wasn't even sure she could go back to the restaurant. Who would follow her after she had messed up so badly? She'd be a joke, a laughingstock, and if she did go back to her cooking show, it would be as a public spectacle. She reached into her pocket for tissues or napkins or something, but what she came out with was the business card of the man that she had been so afraid to see. She stared at it for a while, not sure she wanted to flip it over, but after a while she did, and her eyes went wide. She put it down, her hands shaking so badly she was afraid she might rip it. What was that number? For her talent, he had said, but what did it mean? Was it a job offer, a sign-on bonus, or something else? She looked at the front of the card. She wouldn't know unless she called. The number came slowly as her shaking fingers pressed the buttons, and it rang twice before someone picked up. "Libra's Talent, Lucifer Jones speaking." She was silent, not sure how to begin, but apparently they had been waiting for her. "Miss Schaefer, is that you?" She jumped, startled that they remembered her. Yes, she finally said. "Have you called to make arrangements for your talent?" "I have," she said, before she could think better of it. "Stupendous! Mr. Sereph is making arrangements to meet you at your home for a demonstration this evening. We are very interested in acquiring your talent for our growing roster. Will tonight work for you?" Her teeth were chattering. Maggie didn't want that old ghoul anywhere near her house, but she knew that if she hoped to get the sum on the back of the card, she would need to show him what she could do. That kind of money could help her put some distance from this town. From people she knew who wouldn't let her forget her slip-up. The laughter wasn't what scared her, not really. What she couldn't stand would be the looks of disappointment. JD would be disappointed. So would the staff at Salome's, and she couldn't stand for that. She would want to leave, to go somewhere where they couldn't find her, and the money would help her with that. "Yes, tell him I'll see him tonight. My address is..." We know all about you, Miss Maggie. We'll be there, 7 p.m. sharp, so make sure you're at home." He hung up on her then, leaving her sitting there with the phone against her ear, and a deep sense of dread running up and down her veins. What exactly had she agreed to? She didn't know, but she supposed she would find out. When her phone rang at 6:45, Maggie jumped a mile. She had been drinking wine in her living room, trying to get in the right headspace for what was to come. She had been right. Someone had leaked her little mishap today, and it was trending online pretty hard. She had seen it on TikTok, on Facebook, and had been sent a couple of them by JD earlier in the evening. Her slip had been set to Benny Hill music, Thriller, some song by Blood on the Dance Floor, and a slew of other things. The comment section had been brutal, and Maggie was in a state. She'd been trying to put it out of her mind so she could get ready for tonight, but when the phone rang, she was afraid it would be her mother or one of her cousins who wanted to laugh at what a klutz she was. It wasn't, though. It was JD. "Mags, why didn't you call me? This is great. We can totally..." "I messed up, JD. I didn't want to talk to anyone after that. I dropped food all over McManus. McManus! I'm surprised he didn't cuss me right then and there. Maggie, you're looking at this all wrong. You're a viral sensation. We can spin this." I don't see how. I'm off the show. I can't go back to Channel 12 as a laughingstock. I may not even be able to..." "Who said you were off the show?" She stopped for a moment, JD's words washing over her. "What?" "Roger got kicked off this episode. He made this awful stink about not using animals in his cooking and made a hummus instead. He got disqualified on the spot. And once the judges tried your burger, there was no chance you weren't going on to the next round." Maggie stood up, careful to set the wine glass down so she didn't drop it. Maybe there was a chance to salvage this. She was going on to the next round. There was still a chance to make something of this. She could still win. She could take home the prize, and all anyone would talk about in the end was the meme. Someone knocked on her door, and Maggie realized it was 7 o'clock. "I gotta go, JD," she said, hanging up on him as he tried to squeeze out a few more ideas. She went to the door, and there he was, smiling at her as he stood on the stoop. He still looked like an undertaker, and she still found herself afraid of him. But as he came in to sit at her table, she found that she could tolerate him for a little while. "It seems that fate is trying to draw you to me. I keep seeing you everywhere, and I'm tired of it." He just smiled his enigmatic smile and took a book from his coat. It was huge, like the family Bible her parents had owned, but it was anything but holy. The outside was thick and cracked, the leather ancient but still soft as calfskin. It looked like it might bite if you put your hand too close, and he opened it to reveal a list of names within. He took a silver pen from the inside of his coat and handed it to her with a little flourish. She looked at the pen dubiously, not sure what he wanted. "Do I sign that? Is that some sort of contract?" "More of a pact. Sign your name and receive your compensation. It really is that simple." Maggie took the pen with trembling hands, setting it to the page as she prepared to sign. She was still a little hesitant to get anywhere near that book, but as she signed her name and laid the pen inside, she looked up expectantly. "Okay, now what?" He pulled out another book. She found to her surprise it was a cookbook. "Open it, and let's begin." She chuckled a little, realizing her name was on the book. "I don't see what this has to do with..." But as the book came open, Maggie felt her breath leave her. It was like phantom fingers rummaging through her mind. They were using her like a Rolodex, taking what they wanted and leaving her mind empty and violated. She could see the empty cookbook filling up, and as it snapped shut, another took its place. Maggie felt those phantom fingers taking everything, lifting her most cherished parts, but she was powerless to do anything but stand there and let it happen. As the third book took its place, that's when she noticed her hands. Her hands had begun to prune, like someone who'd spent too much time in the bath. As the fourth book appeared, she found that she couldn't even feel it. When the fifth book took its place, she was growing weak. She filled up 10 in all, and Mr. Sereph seemed well pleased when she finally blacked out. "Worth the price, as I'd known it would be." That's where JD found her the next day, lying on the floor of her living room, her hands shriveled and useless. When she hadn't arrived to shoot that morning, he had gone straight to her apartment to make sure that she hadn't done something drastic. She was so upset after the day before that I was worried she might have done something stupid. Now I don't know what to think. The hospital didn't have a clue either. Her hands bore signs of nerve damage, and she was completely unable to hold anything heavier than a pencil for the rest of her life. What was worse, she couldn't remember anything about cooking. JD worried that she might have hit her head or something, but Maggie knew what it had been. Mr. Sereph had taken all that away and paid her handsomely for it. No one ever questioned how she had become a millionaire overnight, but the money helped ease some of the sting. She was careful with it, careful not to live outside her means, but it never became an issue. JD helped some. After the social media circus around her fall, the actual media circus around her story was big news. JD helped set up interviews, got her news spots, and even got her a spot on several talk shows. Maggie was a small celebrity, but she was always careful not to mention Mr. Sereph. She had some vague idea that no one would take her seriously, and the people who would could be dangerous. She told them it was some kind of sudden spontaneous nerve deterioration, something the doctors had floated, and they seemed to like that idea. A year later, Maggie was sitting in New York at one of those fancy restaurants McManus owned when he came out to her table to say hello. She was a little starstruck when he came swaggering over, the tall and muscled chef that everyone seemed to live in fear of, and when he smiled from under that thick mustache, it put her at ease. "Think nothing of it, darling. I knew I had to come say hello when they told me you were here. What brings you to New York?" "I've got an appointment at some clinic, some new procedure that they think will give me some mobility again. It won't, but some kind of benefactor is paying for it after hearing my story, so I could hardly decline." He laughed. He had a good laugh. "Well, you must let me make you something. It's the least I can do. You made me something the last time we met." It was Maggie's turn to laugh. "Yeah, a mess. I'm so sorry. That was unintentional," she started, but he waved it off. "Think nothing of it, darling. I tried it after you ran off. Bloody tasty. Let me make you something to return the favor." She thanked him, and 30 minutes later, he was bringing her a plate of meatloaf with carrots, peas, mashed potatoes. Maggie raised an eyebrow at it. It was a little simple for a place with 4 Michelin stars, but she couldn't complain. Maggie hadn't even been able to cook eggs after that night, and the woman she had hired to cook for her usually just made fancy dishes. This reminded her of home. Her hand shook a little as she lifted the fork, but her hands always shook these days. As she put the first bite in her mouth, she tasted something she hadn't in a very long time. This wasn't just any meatloaf. This was her grandmother's meatloaf. Baba had taught her to make it before she died, swearing her to secrecy on the exact recipe. At least she had, before Mr. Sereph had taken it from her. "Glad you like it," McManus said. "But then again, that burger wasn't the only thing you made me, was it?" She watched him return to his kitchen, wanting to be mad, but only finding tears. She cried into her meatloaf as she ate, knowing it would be the last taste of Grandma's meatloaf she ever had. He had set his table up an hour before sunset. His suit was immaculate for someone who lived out of his car, and Lucifer knew it was the key to his operation. A lot of these people who hawked did so in clothes that made them look like bums. Lucifer, however, was a born salesman, and he knew that if he couldn't buy you, then you wouldn't buy from him. Lucifer Marvelous Jones had the unfortunate luck to be the child of Cassie Koppel, a lifetime resident of Forest View Asylum. When the 42-year-old woman had come up pregnant, the questions of patronage had immediately arisen. Cassie said, and stuck with her story for the rest of her life, that Lucifer himself had visited her and begot her with his offspring. She held the death within her that was warned about in Revelations, and she would bring it into this world no matter what they thought. The staff was pretty sure that it had been Charles Danver, an orderly who had recently been fired for inappropriate relations with residents. But when Lucifer had been born, his skin was the color of coal, and it led to more questions than answers. The state took him away not long after they wrestled him from his mother, and thus Lucifer Marvelous Jones entered the system, a system that was kinder to him than most. Lucifer, despite his name and his humble beginnings, was possessed of an infectious smile and an unshakable positivity that others liked. He was adopted at 4 and lived with a middle-class family until his grades and impressive IQ were made note of by a local philanthropist who adopted him again and gave him a peerless education. Lucifer's grades ensured him a place at any college he wanted, and his backers' financial stability ensured that wherever he went, it would be the best. He had a degree in business before 25. The world prepared for him to open his own Fortune 500 company any day now. He surprised them further by taking up politics and philosophy, and his benefactor hoped that maybe he'd go into politics himself. He learned all he could about the human condition, studied psychology and human nature, and then surprised them all one final time by disappearing without a trace. He took some clothes and a bag, his best suit and shoes, left in his car one day with no intention of returning. That had been nearly a decade ago, but Lucifer had never stopped learning. He had simply changed classrooms. "Hey there, friend," he called to a man in a suit almost as nice as his. "Come have a chat for a minute. I got something I'd like to show you." The man would have been a hard mark for anyone else, but not for Lucifer. He was a businessman, a middle management type who clearly had dreams of rising, and normally he would have no more stopped to talk to someone on the sidewalk than he would have taken out his wallet and left it on the lamppost. He was on his phone, but Lucifer had no doubt that he had heard him. He never let doubt enter his mind, and when the man turned, he hooked him with his winning smile and lured him in. The man looked surprised to be standing before the suited man's card table, but the hawker wasn't. He was right where he wanted him, and that was good. "Your case," Lucifer said, the man looking down at his battered Samsonite briefcase. "It's unbecoming of a man in your position." The businessman looked confused. "What's wrong with it?" "Oh, nothing. For someone who doesn't want to rise higher than middle management, that is. But you," he said the last words like he meant to roll in it, "you have big dreams. You can't hold papers for dreams as big as yours in a case like that." Lucifer reached beneath the table and produced something he'd been holding just for this man. It was a gorgeous leather attaché case with golden buckles and a polished brass handle, the kind of case the boss carried so that everyone knew who he was. The man's eyes lit up when he saw it, but Lucifer pulled it back out of reach. "Not before we've talked price, my friend." The man looked at him for a moment like he meant to fight him, but he wouldn't be the first to try. It wouldn't do him any better than it had done the others either. "The price," Lucifer said, his voice dropping a little, "is something small. Give me what you have in your wallet for starters. I know it isn't much, but the second part is the big ask." The man nodded, shakily fishing his wallet out before handing Lucifer the $300 inside. Lucifer produced a gym bag then, placing it on the table gingerly. "Take this bag to 2369 Hammerlock Plaza. Leave it in the lobby, and leave without being seen. If you're seen, I'll know and come to get the case back. Do this, and the case will be yours." The man looked enraptured as he took the bag and case, nodding furiously before heading up the sidewalk with a new spring in his step. "That was deftly done," said someone from behind him. "You have a definite talent, my friend." Lucifer didn't jump, didn't tense, but it was the first time in a while that someone had snuck up on him. He turned his head a little as he saw the man in the coal-black suit, his hands on the end of a cane and his rump on the bench where Lucifer had taken the case from. "I should hope so, sir. I've been perfecting my art for years," Lucifer said. "Longer than you might suspect, I think," the man said, but Lucifer didn't let it affect him. He turned back to the crowd, angry that he had almost missed the woman as she came walking past. He'd been planning this for weeks, and he wasn't about to miss his chance. "'Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his smile attached when she turned with a nearly rehearsed swivel. "I believe I have something that you might be looking for." She walked over dreamily, and when he pulled out the porcelain figure from beneath the table, she shuddered in surprise. How did you know?" she said, reaching for it with a shaky hand. He covered it, though, with his big dark one, smiling disarmingly as he set the hook. "I have an eye for precious things, and people who share a love of fine things. All I ask," he said as he produced a letter, "is that you drop this into a mailbox for me. Somewhere near your work should do it, and you can take your prize with you." She snatched the letter, nodding as she took the figurine and walked briskly away. "Did you need something, friend?" Lucifer asked, without looking at the man. "I don't believe I've seen a face as distinct as yours before." The man had a smile that belonged in a funhouse, but Lucifer couldn't deny that he was charming and had a certain magnetism to him. "Oh, it isn't what you can do for me," the man said. "It's more what I can do for you. A man of your talent could—" "Hold that thought," Lucifer said, whistling to a high school girl as she came walking past. Her eyes traveled from her phone for the first time in hours, and she came over to the hawker willingly enough. When he pulled out the bag, the look told him that she would have done all manner of degrading things to have it. Lucifer, however, needed no such act. "Take this letter to the owner of the deli on 3rd and Foreman. Tell him 7 o'clock, and don't be late. Bring the number 3 to the house we discussed. Do this, or this bag will be back in my possession by nightfall. Understand?" She nodded, thanking him again and again before walking away in a hurry. "Now then," Lucifer said, "you were saying." "As I was saying, your talents are of interest to us. We would like to purchase them for our company so that they can be utilized by our clients." "How interesting," Lucifer commented. "Does that line often work on people?" The man looked taken aback by his statement. "Excuse me?" "Oh, no disrespect, but I suspect that you're used to doing business with desperate individuals who value money a bit too much. The wording of your statement leads them to believe you're offering them work or perhaps a trade. They don't realize their mistake until the deal is struck, then must lament at leisure what they have lost. Am I close?" The man wanted to be angry, Lucifer could tell, but there was a level of curiosity to the old devil that intrigued him as much as it intrigued him. "But not you?" he asked, switching his grin for something a little more sardonic. "You're too great a salesman to be huckstered by my obvious naivete." Lucifer laughed. "You are many things, sir, but I don't believe that naive is one of them. No, you're someone whose empire makes mine look like a sandcastle to a king. I admit, I doubt I am as skilled a liar as you are, nor do I have as much experience rooking the sheep as Richard T. Sereph, but I'm no layman, and I can smell a predator when it enters my territory." The man's eyes gave away his surprise at being named, but his smile was no less merry. Very well met, Lucifer Marvelous Jones. It seems that you have me at a disadvantage, something that doesn't often happen in my line of work." Lucifer steepled his fingers, letting the crowd pass behind him as the real battle of wills happened right here on his busy street corner. This was the single greatest deal of the man's life, and he knew it had the potential to go bad with only a single misstep. Lucifer had made worse deals, however, and was always willing to bet on his abilities. Besides, he'd come prepared for this meeting. "So, let me offer you a counter deal. I will not sell you my talent. It's far too valuable to sell, and I suspect that you don't want to buy it for just anyone either. I suspect that you want to monopolize my talent and use it to further your own endeavors. Am I correct in assuming as much?" Mr. Sereph nodded, looking genuinely impressed with the young man's assessment of him. Impressive, but I should have suspected nothing less from the shadow broker of East Los Angeles. "And yet, you thought that I'd sell my talent like someone looking for a fix," he said, putting his old tone back on with a laugh, showing that he wasn't insulted, but only disappointed. Mr. Sereph shrugged. "I had to try. I haven't come up against one of your kind who is such a match for me in a long time, and are unlikely to for quite some time," Lucifer admonished. "I am, after all, the Antichrist, if you believe my mother." Mr. Sereph's laugh was rich and terrible, and many of the people walking by shuddered, though they knew not why. I can assure you, Mr. Jones, you are not. That one has not yet been born, and hopefully will not be for many generations yet." "In that case," said Mr. Jones, "I propose a trade." Mr. Sereph raised an eyebrow at him. "A trade, you say?" "Never fear, sir. It's a trade that's mutually beneficial for both of us." "I'm all ears," said Mr. Sereph, smiling as he folded his hands in his lap. Here it was, his one chance. Lucifer hoped he was up to the challenge. "I propose that you hire me, and we further each other's objectives." Whatever Mr. Sereph had been expecting, his face showed Lucifer that a job proposition wasn't it. "A job! A job! You want to work for me!" It was Lucifer's turn to smile. "Don't act so surprised. Libra's talent is a very lucrative venture, but it's a venture that requires talent. You are one person," he hedged, not wanting to insult him, but not wanting to undersell him either. "And you've been the sole representative of Inquisitions for quite some time. Why not let me help? I do have a knack for talking people into things, as well as convincing them that I can provide them with what they want." Mr. Sereph looked shocked, gobsmacked even, and when he leaned forward, Lucifer thought it might be the first time he'd been taken off guard in a long time. "Well, goodness, I haven't had to do anything like an interview in so long. I don't guess you have a resume I can look over, do you?" Lucifer thought about it for a moment. "I may, actually. Do you recall my transactions this morning?" Mr. Sereph nodded, ticking off items on his finger. "You sold a gaudy briefcase, a tacky figurine, and an overpriced purse." Lucifer smiled, but it was hard to keep the derision off his face. "Correct, though inaccurate and a little insulting. I sold a Lavar Manuel attaché case to a businessman who's hoping to impress his boss. In exchange, he gave me $300 and, more importantly, will drop off a duffel bag in the lobby of a building that holds a certain law firm. The woman traded a rare Hummel figurine for the promise that she will drop a letter in a mailbox for me. The letter contains evidence that the owner of Pax & Sons Law Office has been cheating on his wife with a mistress. Lastly, I traded a Lou Bodwin signature handbag for the promise of a message being delivered to Gino's Italiano. The message will ensure that food is delivered to the law office of Bob Steffens at exactly 7 p.m. That will mean that his door is open when the man I've instructed to go and break his knees goes to fulfill his contract. Very devilish, Mr. Sereph said, but what does that have to do with anything? The duffel bag contains drugs that will be traced back to the law office in the building. The wife of Jim Pax will ensure that a rift forms between him and his sons, who are his partners. Bob Steffen will have his knees broken and will be unable to recover fully. All of this will ensure that Joseph Treadwell, of Treadwell, Gabe, and Droff, is one of the few practicing attorneys in the area when a certain high-profile case comes up next week. It will also place him in my debt and leave no way to trace any of this back to me. Mr. Sereph looked impressed, but not sold. It was time for the closer. All this is very impressive, but still doesn't show me why I should hire you. Of course not, Lucifer said. You won't understand that until I sell you something you want. Mr. Sereph laughed for true then, and it sounded like fingernails on wind chimes. Me? You think you have something that will turn my head? I admire your courage, Lucifer Jones, but I don't believe you have anything that will interest me. We'll see, Lucifer said, leaning down so he could reach beneath the bench where Mr. Sereph sat. From beneath him, he took a box, a simple wooden box, but as he set it in his lap, he knew the old demon could sense something within it. It was something special, the first and only gift his mother had ever given him, except his life. He'd kept it since it had been mailed to him by someone at the adoption agency when he had turned 18. It was his most prized possession, and he knew it was just what he needed. Did you know that the doctor handed my mother something on the day I was born? Something very special. Oh? Mr. Sereph asked, trying for disinterest, but finding it hard to maintain. Yes, it was the only thing she had to remember me by for 17 years before her death. They said that a week before she died, she mailed it to my caseworker, telling me that it was my birthright and my inheritance. It's my most prized possession, and if you agree to hire me, I'll give it to you. Mr. Sereph swallowed loudly, his eyes boring into the box as he waited for it to be unveiled. Lucifer opened the box, and inside was a wonder. It was a black feather, the end forged into an ink pen, and it was the most beautiful thing that Lucifer had ever seen. He had sat in bed the night after receiving it and ran the feather over his chin, feeling its texture and hearing the words of the letter in a voice that he had never heard in life. It's your birthright, your inheritance, the letter had said, and he had known it was very special. Mr. Sereph looked at the feather, delighted and not bothering to hide it. He was like a child who receives exactly what he wants for Christmas, and now cannot believe that he's seen it made real. It was clear that he wanted to reach for it, but he seemed unable to just yet. Where did you get this? He asked breathlessly. My mother claimed I was holding it when she delivered me, and she claimed it was proof of my true patronage. When Mr. Sereph tried to reach for it, his long-fingered hands trembling, Lucifer closed the box with a snap. What do you say? Lucifer asked, offering him a hand. Mr. Sereph thought about it, clearly not used to being on this end of the deal. before shaking it with a smile and a deep belly laugh. Welcome to Libra's talent, Lucifer Marvelous Jones. I believe you will fit in very well here. Okay, so here's everything you need for that New York Times best-selling novel. I've got all the lore, the layout, everything you should need to bring it off. Mr. Torrance leafed through the notebook, shaking his head as he blew out a long breath. Thomas, this is amazing. Why aren't you using these ideas? You've sold me so many fantasy novels. Why not cash in yourself? Thomas snorted into his macchiato. What's wrong, Mr. T? You tired of being on the bestseller list? No, God, no, but... The old guy thought about it for a minute before answering. Why not publish these yourself? Why sell them to me? Thomas shrugged. Honestly, I don't have the drive to sit down and turn them all into novels. I like coming up with the concepts and writing the lore, but whenever I try to write them down, I get bored and just come up with more concepts. They're better in your hands, man. Mr. Torrance looked to see if he was joking, and shook his head as he took out his checkbook and wrote Thomas the agreed-upon sum. I swear, Thomas, you might be the best writer who doesn't write I've ever met. Thomas smiled and put the check in his wallet. Thanks. Tell your friends. He was still smiling when he walked out of the bank an hour later, the bills paid for the next 4 months, and all for a couple of hours of work. Torrance would write another book and go on talk shows and sign autographs, and Thomas would pay his bills, go on dates, and generally live his life. There were people out there who would have been angry at this, but not Thomas. Thomas had seen what the spotlight does to people, and he didn't want it. Thomas O'Hare, son of Jack O'Hare, had seen the devastation of rising to the top. As a child, he had told his father endless stories about knights and elves, spacemen and terrible aliens, about haunted houses and mysterious lands, and his father had soaked it all up like a sponge. Jack O'Hare had been a middling writer, a struggling columnist, and a mediocre father, but Thomas had loved sitting in his study, telling him stories. That's great, Tommy boy, his father would say, writing and writing and writing, as his son told him tales of everything and anything. When his father had written Watchtower, a story about the knights who manned the watchtowers of Elise and protected them from the dragons and elves that roamed the desert, he'd made a cool 90,000 off it, and another 50 for the rights to the short miniseries. Thomas remembered watching it on TV and was happy that his daddy had brought his story to life. By the time he was 15, Thomas began to understand what was going on. His father had written a book a year since he was 4, sold ideas and multiple pitches to producers, and they had come up in the world quite a bit. Thomas was also aware that his mother suspected that the visits to writers' conventions were an excuse to sleep with strange women in new cities. She had caught him at it more than once, the partners usually young enough to remember high school, but Thomas's father always said the same thing. Go on then, Maggie, leave me. Take the boy and whatever the court decides you get and live in some shitty little apartment with a shitty little car and a shitty little life. I'm making the big bucks here, and you want to be with the man who makes the big bucks, 'cause he buys the good stuff. Do you really think Tommy is going to want to live in some rundown shack when he can stay with me in luxury? Keep dreaming. She had stayed, but Thomas hadn't. His father had raged when he told him. By then, he'd been into a habit that was eating up his savings quicker than he could pitch ideas. But Thomas said his ideas had dried up. He didn't have anything for his old man, and as the money ran out, so had all the rest. No more talk shows, no more book signings, no more conventions, and certainly no more 20-somethings sniffing around for scraps. The fortunes of Jack O'Hare had dwindled, but Thomas's were just starting to build. His father had fallen into obscurity, and Thomas had begun selling his ideas to people who would appreciate them, and the one writing them. He'd put his poor mother up somewhere after he'd convinced her to leave his father in the pit that he'd dug for himself. And now, he only heard from his dear old dad in the slowly deteriorating voicemails he left him. Thomas wasn't sorry for what he'd done. His father was a leech, and eventually, leeches got squished. "Hey T, you got that?" "Right here, Ray," Thomas said, tossing him a thumb drive. "That's all the research, sources, and footnotes you'll need for your thesis." Raymond cackled, pumping his fist as he jumped the back of the couch and landed beside Thomas. "T, how do you do this? You're like a genie or something. I just make a wish and sim sim salabim," he intoned and extended his fingers. "Like magic." Thomas shrugged as he made a disgusted noise. This was the 4th time he had tried to kill this boss, and he was getting a little tired of dying. "I don't know, Ray. It's like a mutant superpower or something. I always just know what people need. Stories, information, whatever. They need it, I have it. They pay for it, and I provide it." "Speaking of," Raymond said, taking out his wallet, but Thomas put a hand out. "Not for you, Ray. Taking your money would be like eating your leftovers. Satisfying, but not wholly helpful." Ray chuckled. "And the fact that once I get my doctorate, I'll be making enough to pay for our apartment 3 times over has nothing to do with this?" "It might. I'm sure I can't keep this up forever, and I might need someone in high places to help me out someday." Raymond took the controller from him as he died again. "Don't worry about that, T. You know I've always got your back," he said, killing the boss fairly easily before handing it back to Thomas. Thomas reflected that it had always been like that with them. He and Raymond had known each other since elementary school, and they had felt drawn together in a way that he couldn't explain. Thomas needed Raymond to ground him, and Raymond needed Thomas to give him stability. Thomas always seemed to have the resources that Ray needed to succeed, and Raymond had the drive and the ambition that Thomas seemed to be missing. Raymond would go places, Thomas knew, and Thomas would follow because he liked to watch Raymond soar. When Thomas had left home at 16 so he didn't have to watch his father's decline, Raymond's family had been more than happy to take him in. When Raymond needed help getting into med school, Thomas had helped him with his tuition. The two were there for each other, always had been, and Thomas saw no reason for it to stop now. His phone vibrated, and he hit pause as he pulled it out and checked the message. "Tomorrow at 2 at Jillybeans." "That's not ominous or anything," Raymond said, glancing over his shoulder. "It's just business. It's nothing illegal, as you know." Raymond shook his head. "True, but it never gets any less weird." Thomas smiled as he continued his quest through the bleak landscapes of Dark Souls 2. Raymond wasn't wrong, but damn, was it lucrative. Thomas arrived early, got himself a coffee, and took a seat in the booth by the wall where he usually sat. Jillybeans was one of his usual spots, and the owner nodded at him as they locked eyes. He liked it here. The ambience was very old school, and Thomas enjoyed smelling the grinding beans, hearing the machines as they brewed, and listening to the chatter around him. He pulled his phone out and let the buyer know that he was here, making some notes on his phone about a new idea that he'd had on the way. Pirates, a mysterious island, sunken ships, ghost fleets, and a treasure beneath the waves. It had Summer Blockbuster written all over it. He looked up as someone took a seat, grimacing as he looked back down at his phone just as fast. "I'm meeting someone. If you want to buy ideas, you'll have to make an appointment." "I'm afraid your client won't be arriving," said the fellow in the tailored suit, his sleek black hair held under a bowler hat, which he sat on the table. "Oh, and why might that be?" "Because we made them a better deal in exchange for when and where they were meeting you. You, as it happens, are a hard man to track down, Thomas O'Hare." Thomas was a little startled that the man knew his name, but he hid it well. "You've gone through a lot of trouble to find me. I'm guessing you're, what, IRS, feds? I can assure you that all my money is made legally, and I'm not paying taxes on it. I make it through my own sweat and efforts, so you can—" No, Mr. O'Hare. I work for someone who is, let's say, morally gray, but even we aren't that evil. No, I represent someone who has a mutual interest in your enterprise. Thomas lifted an eyebrow. I didn't know what I had was an enterprise. Oh, yes. Quite a lucrative one, actually, said the young man in the suit. And I suppose you and your boss are looking to invest, is that it? Quite the contrary. We'd like you to stop. Thomas blinked at him. What? To stop, to cease, to end what you're doing. You see, my employer has been doing it for a very long time, and you are encroaching on his business. Thomas looked at him for a few seconds before he started to chuckle. He expected the kid would pick it up, but no such luck. He just sat there, smiling politely, waiting for Thomas to get it out. You're joking, right? This is a joke, right? The man shook his head. Afraid not. My employer is very serious. Look, I don't know who your employer is, Mr. Lucifer, the man said, and Thomas's eyes got very big. No, not that one. Lucifer T. Jones, Acquisitions Officer for Libris Talent. We acquire talent from those who cannot utilize it properly, but we also sell that talent to those in need of it. You're selling the fruits of your talent, something we simply can't have. We will be very happy to pay you for your talent, but you monopolizing such a vast talent in this way is unacceptable. Thomas gave Lucifer a skeptical look. And if I decide not to sell it to you? Lucifer went right on smiling, but it was less friendly than it had been. Well then, we would have no choice but to lean on you, disrupt your business, make things very difficult for you. Thomas scoffed, getting up as he glowered at Lucifer. Good luck with that. I sell ideas, sir, and the need for ideas is always high. Lucifer pulled a hand out of his pocket so quickly that Thomas almost saw the gun he expected to be there. There was no way. Was this well-dressed man just going to blow him away right here in Jilly Beans? It was unthinkable. He'd never get away with it. Was his boss this serious about profit margins? He had slitted his eyes, waiting for the pain, but when he opened them, he saw the business card in the young man's hand, a startling cream color against his dark skin. In case you change your mind, a talent like yours would be at a premium, to be sure. Thomas walked off without taking the card, but found it later in his wallet. Whoever this Lucifer Jones was, he was more than met the eye. Mr. Sorrels, you told me you were looking for fantasy? The man was not one of his usual clients, but Thomas couldn't turn down business. He had several fantasy drafts that would grow into novels worth a mint, and if Mr. Sorrels had the cash, Thomas had the ideas. Sorrels, for his part, looked like someone interested in something different. He was sweaty, very shaky, and did a lot of smiling. Yeah, definitely. What kind of novels do you have? Well, I have this. It's called The Kingdom of Elwith. It's a marriage intrigue about... Yeah, that sounds great. Hey, let's walk a bit as we talk. It's hard to hear you in here, and I want all the details before I make my decision. Thomas looked around, growing a little wary of the man and his shaky smile. Ground Level, another of his favorite coffee shops, was mostly empty, and the noise was at an acceptable level. Why did this guy want to stroll and talk? It was likely to be louder on the sidewalk than in here. Something wasn't adding up here, and Thomas didn't like it. Look, Mr. Sorrels, if you want the material, then it's $3,500, non-negotiable. My work generally brings in 10 times what I charge, and this one has real potential. I'm sure you've heard about my previous clients and the quality of my stories. So, do we have a deal or not? Mr. Sorrels kept looking at the door, his smile looking sickly, and when Thomas glanced that way, he felt like someone was watching from across the street. It wasn't the smiling Lucifer Jones either. This man was corpsey, a man-thing in a tailored suit, and his eyes were flinty as it smiled that rictus of a grin. I just don't know. That's a lot of money, and I think we should talk about it more. The weather's so nice, and But Thomas had heard enough. He got up, and to his surprise, the man grabbed his arm. It was more like a request than a demand, but Thomas pulled away and practically ran for the door. This wasn't his normal sale, and he didn't like the feel of it. The guy was trying to lure him off, and suddenly Thomas wanted nothing so much as to be back in the safety of his apartment, with the door locked and the world kept at bay. "Wait!" the man said shrilly, but Thomas was already away. The specter was gone, but as he went home, Thomas felt eyes on him nonetheless. It was something he would become used to in the coming weeks. Thomas was walking home that night when a van pulled slowly along behind him. His hands were full of groceries, just a few things for the house, and he was shaking his head as he thought about the weirdo at ground level. What the hell had that been about? He'd had guys try to stiff him on payment, bounce their checks on purpose, or what have you, but Sorrels had almost tried to grab him. What had he hoped to accomplish, Thomas wondered. Had Lucifer put some kind of bounty on his head? And what if he had? The money couldn't have been worth getting caught, and Thomas couldn't imagine a talent company would be that interested in him. The van was pulling up next to him, and Thomas turned to look just as the yawning mouth of the van's side door slid open, and hands reached out for him. They weren't even bothering with masks, and the faces he saw didn't exactly look like the kind of fellows who snatched people off the street. They were pale, disheveled, and looked a lot like Sorrels had. He would have thought them junkies, but he'd worked with writers long enough to know the look. These were academics, not kidnappers, but the hands that reached out to take hold of him were strong and determined, nonetheless. Thomas swung his grocery bag at them, breaking the pasta sauce and rupturing his milk as he fought them off. They fell back, not expecting his barrage of foodstuffs, and as they did, Thomas took off. The van screeched to life, but he was cutting down a shortcut before they could catch up to him. His adrenaline was up, and Thomas was showing his heels. He didn't stop until the door was secure behind him, and when it was, he crumpled into a ball, his fear coursing through him like a drug. Thomas swung his eyes from side to side, looking more like a scared deer than his usual self. The last 2 weeks had been a nightmare that Thomas was unable to wake up from. It hadn't ended with the attempted kidnapping from the van. Most of his clients had either stopped answering or seemed far too interested in meeting him. Their messages were not the ones he'd received before, and they were full of empty platitudes and strange desires to meet in places Thomas didn't usually meet his clients. After the incident at ground level, Thomas was hesitant to meet people, and his business suffered because of it. He'd felt hunted when he left the apartment, and not just by people on the street. The eyes of that strange cadaverous thing seemed to follow him, and Thomas was beginning to think that this might be the benefactor that Lucifer Jones had spoken of. So he stopped going out. Thomas had plenty of funds. He didn't need to sell for a while. He could just wait for this to blow over. It was no big deal. It would end soon, and he could return to business as usual. Then, today, Raymond texted him and said he had left his books at home. "Hey, left my chem book at home. Can you bring them to the chem lab for me by 6? Thanks, man." The message was fairly mundane. Thomas wouldn't have risked it, but Ray was close to graduation, and he needed to keep his grades up if he was going to get his doctorate. Every face on the street seemed more menacing than the last, and Thomas kept his head down and his cap pulled low as he approached the university. In and out, quick and easy. Then he could get back to the apartment and lock all the locks and feel better in his mind. He would be safe there. He was always safe there. And as he entered the Heisman building, he made his way to the chem lab. He was nearly there, the door in sight, when a familiar voice called out to him. "T, what are you doing here?" Thomas exhaled in relief. "There you are. Here, I got your chem book like you asked for." Raymond seemed confused. "Thanks, but chem isn't till Thursday." "You sent me a text and said you needed it," Thomas said, glancing back at the lab door and only now noticing that only the emergency lights were on inside. Nope. In fact, I lost my phone earlier. I haven't sent any texts all day. Must have been a wrong number, bud. Sorry. Thomas felt his breath quicken. If he looked carefully, he thought he could see the shadows against the wall. What were they planning to do? Were they going to take him to the Shadow Man? To turn him in for some kind of reward? What the hell was this? Thomas had never felt so pursued in his entire life, and he didn't like it. T, you okay? He jumped when Raymond touched his shoulder, but he nodded hastily. God, they had stolen Ray's phone. They could have just as easily hurt him, but they hadn't. It seemed they hadn't become that desperate. Yet. Would they stop with the phone next? Would they hurt Raymond to get to him? If they kidnapped Thomas, then would they really stop it? I gotta go, Thomas said, rushing off as he ignored Ray's calls from behind him. He had the business card out before he hit the sidewalk, the numbers tripping over themselves as he dialed. Mr. O'Hare, said the smooth voice of Lucifer Jones. We've been waiting for you. Meet me at Jilly Beans in 30 minutes. I don't want to be accosted by anyone either. I know you have something to do with this, and if it will put an end to it, then I'm willing to deal. Of course. I'll be there in 30 minutes, but I think it might be better if I met you somewhere safer, somewhere you would feel secure. Your apartment, maybe. Thomas felt a cold sweat break out on his neck, feeling the eyes on him already. They were hungry, and they knew there would be something to gain from taking him now. Would they try to grab him right here on the street? Thomas didn't know, but he suspected the prize was grand enough to make them sloppy. Fine, 30 minutes at my apartment. Don't be late, or the deal's off. As he hung up, he heard several phones chirp all at once. He was running again, figuring Lucifer had let them know the deal was off. He wanted to be far away before they decided the deal might be back on if they went ahead and grabbed him. He wanted to be well away before they found their nerve. Unsurprisingly, Lucifer was waiting for him when he arrived. I assumed you wanted to get this over with. Shall we? Thomas opened the door, and despite wanting to slam it in his face, he let Lucifer Jones into his sanctuary. I'm glad you came to your senses. We wouldn't want any unpleasantness over this. What do I need to do? Thomas said, not in the mood for veiled threats or pleasantries. Just sign your name here, Lucifer said, taking out a thick leather book and opening it to the front page, and it will all be over. The book was thick, old, bound in what could have been leather or human skin. Thomas couldn't explain it, but the book felt like it was watching him. It was a hateful old thing, the kind of book that Faust had signed, he was sure, and he didn't like the sight of it on his coffee table any more than he liked the man holding it in his apartment. And this is what? Thomas said, shuddering a little as he looked at the book. A contract, a very special one. Sign this, and all your troubles go away. We pay you for your talent, and you never have to worry about us, ever again. Thomas felt his hand freeze as he took up the pen. What was he doing? If he couldn't sell his ideas, he would just be one more person, grinding themselves down a little at a time. He had money saved, but it wouldn't last. He couldn't do this. There had to be another way. He thought of Raymond, though, and that made it easier. Besides, he thought, as he signed the book, he could always find a way around this. He still had his ideas, and that was what mattered. To his surprise, the pen went right on moving across the page. It wrote out the story he had been preparing to sell that day at the coffee shop, all of it in a matter of minutes, and moved on to another. The pages turned, drinking his words, and Thomas was helpless to stop it. What the hell? What is this? Your talent, Lucifer said, and it will make quite an addition to our catalog. The pen took it all, the fantasy, the sci-fi, the horror, the noir, everything. It felt like days passed as the sun darkened and lightened behind the windows of his living room. His hand cramped, his fingers crabbed, but he wrote on. The book grew fangs and terrible eyes, and still he wrote. It took it all, every word, and before he blacked out, the image of Lucifer Jones and his predatory smile were engraved across his psyche forever. Raymond came home that night and found him collapsed on the couch and took him to the hospital. Thomas woke up 3 days later to find an IV in his arm and a worried Raymond by his side. "You scared me," he said, hugging him as if to make sure he was real. "What the hell happened?" "Dunno," Thomas lied hoarsely, but one look at his bank account told him all he needed to know. His lost talent had made him a several times millionaire overnight, but his biggest surprise was still to come. As Thomas lay on the couch weeks later, watching some drivel on television, he winced as a spark shot through his mind. It was a thought, an idea, and he grabbed his phone and took notes. Whatever Lucifer had done hadn't taken everything. They had got his ideas, his trade goods, but they hadn't drained the well. The ideas were rusty, nothing to brag about, but they were a start. Thomas had a seed, and he knew that in time his garden might grow again. And this time, I won't be so quick to sell it, he promised, smiling as the ideas began to take root again. Socialism is no more the answer to capitalism than hedonism is the answer to starvation. We must look to history for the answer. Socialism has been tried many, many times. It has never succeeded, and has always been little more than a stick to prop up the desires of small, weak men. David looked at Carter from across the stage as if he believed he had won. Carter smiled right back at him, preparing to end that thought. I couldn't agree more. The auditorium went quiet at this revelation. There weren't as many people as there would be next week, but the debate team members made up about 15 in all. The 13 not on stage, 14 if you counted Mr. Markle, sat in the seats of the auditorium and watched these two titans of debate ply their craft. The sudden reverse of Carter's platform, capitalism versus socialism, had them stumped, and even his opponent seemed flabbergasted by the sudden turn. "Carter, are you conceding your platform?" Mr. Markle asked. "Far from it," Carter said. "I'm simply saying that just because a perfect form of socialism has never existed, doesn't mean that it should be abandoned. By that logic, since a perfect form of capitalism has never existed, we should shunt it aside as well. We do not throw away concepts in this country, simply because they don't bear fruit. Religion, politics, even concepts such as banking or public works are far from perfect. Yet we continue to change them, evolve them, and such is the nature of this country. Just because all of socialism has never worked before, and Carter put air quotes around the word worked, does not mean that some form might not in the future. Capitalism has failed us in many ways, but we continue to cling to that old concept. Why throw the baby out with the bathwater, just because the soap doesn't appear to be cleaning properly?" David didn't seem to have an answer for that one, and as the other members of the debate team clapped, Carter smiled and shrugged at him. It had been a filibuster, a dirty trick, and he knew it. But just like David knew, in debate you either won or you lost. "Interesting, to say the least," Mr. Markle said, "though technically what you have presented is a non-answer. It is perfectly reasonable, but some of the older judges may find it a poor substitute for fact." Carter smiled. "Mr. Markle, I don't believe I'll find anyone at regionals as skilled a debater as David here." He was rewarded by laughter from the rest of the debate club, but Carter saw that David was not among them. He was being mocked, and he knew it. Carter did not intend to mock, but still he was. In reality, Carter had a lot of respect for David Brown, and his passionate, if not aggressive, debate style. David had a lot of skill at debate. His problem was that he was also a hothead, who could be put off by unorthodox answers or questionable gambits. Carter's answer had technically been a cheat, but David's lack of rebuttal would have been enough to net him a victory. "Well," Mr. Markle said, "I'd say you two are both definitely in the semifinals as our best debaters. We'll see which one of you will progress to the finals after next week's debate with West Central. Until then, study your prompts and prepare for anything. Judges at the semi-final level have been known to use material not present ahead of time, so I advise you to cast your net wide on a multitude of topics." There was some light rumbling as they all grabbed backpacks and book bags and made their way towards the exit to the auditorium. Carter collected up his notes, but when the shadow of David Brown fell over him, he'd been expecting it. He smiled up at him placidly. David was a sore loser, always had been, and ever since he decided that Carter was his rival in the 10th grade, he had taken every loss very personally. "That was a dirty trick, and you know it. Mr. Markle might let crap like that fly in his debate club, but the judges at regionals will. David, unlike you, I've been to regionals before. I was chosen last year to go to regionals, while you sat on the bench and watched. I've been pulling crap like that since I started debating in the 7th grade. I'm fully aware of what I can and cannot get away with in this competition, so why not hit the books a little more, instead of lobbing insults at your betters?" David turned red as a tomato, but instead of swinging one of those impotently balled fists at Carter, he turned and stormed out of the auditorium. Carter slid his notes into his pocket. He had won his second debate that day, it seemed. "The usual Carter?" Carter smiled at the pretty barista as she reached for a new cup. He'd been coming to Jelly Beans for most of his high school life, and Michelle was part of the reason. She was a little older than him, maybe 19 or 20, but she seemed to remember all her customers, and often acted as a coffee-scented therapist for her regulars. "Of course," he said, giving her his winning smile. "I'm celebrating a little, so why not make it a large today?" She laughed as she put the small cup away and got out a bigger one. "Oh, what's the occasion?" "Unrequited dreams, I'm afraid," he said, staring at the counter. "That bad, huh?" she said, adding espresso. "My mom called me after debate club and told me there was a letter from Dartmouth waiting for me on the counter." "Hey, that's good news." "It would be, but no matter what the news, I'll have to refuse them." "And why is that?" Carter turned to look at the speaker, who had rudely barged into his conversation with Michelle, and instantly regretted it. The man was somewhere between 40 and 60, and appeared artlessly handsome in that way that middle-aged men sometimes do. He wore a suit, the cut making Carter think it was tailored and not off the rack, and he could have been a businessman or some kind of stockbroker. But when he smiled at Carter, he felt a cold chill run through him. The smile was too big, taking in most of his mouth, and made Carter think of sharks hunting fish. "Well, not that it's any of your business, but I don't really have the money for college." Michelle set the drink down in front of him, and when their eyes met, he could see that she was pretty put off by this guy. She seemed to be trying to warn him, but also didn't want to insult a customer. Whatever instinct had sent fingers of cold up Carter's spine had apparently affected her as well, and now she was simply hoping this hyena would leave her den without tearing her to shreds. "And why is that?" the man asked, taking a sip of coffee as he put his full attention on the boy. "My parents aren't wealthy. In fact, they work multiple jobs just to keep me in private school. I know it's nearly beggaring them to keep me there, not to mention to pay the mortgage and to feed my other 3 siblings." Carter immediately felt foolish as he admitted all this to the stranger, but it seemed like he'd lost control of his talented tongue. Despite all the warning bells going off about this guy, he brought something out in Carter that he didn't feel often. Did mice tell snakes their deepest secrets before they devoured them? Would this man wring out all his shameful secrets before he swallowed him whole? Aren't there scholarships? No means by which you can get yourself there? I don't play sports. My grades are above average, but nothing that would net me more than a basic scholarship. Debate is really all I have, and unless I can go to state, I don't really have much of a chance to pursue it in college." "What if there was another way?" said the man with the hard-to-look-at face. Carter raised an eyebrow. "Look, sir, I don't know what you're about, but if you're suggesting something improper, far from it, lad. I represent a group of individuals who are interested in talent. They pay good money for said talent, especially in those who may not have the means to utilize it to its full potential." "I see," Carter said, suddenly deciding it might be best to take his coffee elsewhere. "Well, I wish you luck in your pursuits, but I'm not disposed to whatever it is that you may be suggesting. Good day." As he left, he expected the man to attempt to stop him. He expected the man to get angry, or to try to put his mind at ease, when really, what he wanted to do was trap him. He had heard of people like this before, those who came to those in need and tricked them into deals they weren't quite prepared for. This man was likely some sort of purveyor of predatory loans, and Carter had no desire to be in debt to anyone for the rest of his life. He was an intelligent young man, gifted with a silver tongue, and he meant to keep his talent out of the hands of those who might misuse it. Instead, the man only shrugged. "Suit yourself, young man, but I'll be here if you change your mind." Carter did not believe he would be changing his mind on the matter, but youth is often trapped by its folly. Carter was sitting on the commons the next day when David Brown approached him with his group of hangers-on. David, as he had said many times, did not have friends. What he had was a group of admirers and lackeys, people who would have evaporated like smoke if his father had not been rich and David not been popular. Carter had few friends, but at least he knew they were not the simpering followers that David had. "Preparing for your next dirty trick?" David asked heartily, earning him some chuckles from his minions. "Just imagining your dumbfounded face when your father's money doesn't earn you a spot in the debate finals, David." David began to turn red, the anger always so close to the surface with this one. "I'm getting that spot this year, and there isn't a thing you can do about it. Your dirty tricks and foolish pride won't help you this year. I've got an ace in the hole, and I know I'll get the spot." Carter ignored him, leaning his head back as he basked in the midday sun. "We'll see," was all he offered, and when the boys walked away, he felt a pang of frustration worm its way inside of him. What did it matter? What did it matter if he or David went to the debate finals? There would be another David at Dartmouth. There would be many Davids in his life, and all of them would get exactly what they wanted, because they had what Carter did not. David could get into any school off his father's name and the amount in his bank account. Carter had to work twice as hard just because his parents didn't have that luxury. What good would it do to debate when in reality all debates were solved with checkbooks instead of words? He took out the letter and read over it again. "Dear Mr. Mason, congratulations on your acceptance to Dartmouth College. We will have freshman orientation on the second week of August, and enrollment will begin at the end of your current semester. Financial aid is available for those without means, but you may want to look into other sources of payment if these are not amenable. Thank you for your interest in Dartmouth College, and we look forward to seeing you this fall." Alternate sources of payment. That was a nice name for a noose that would hang around his neck. It was his dream school, and he had wanted to go there since he was in the 7th grade. The opportunities he could find at a place like Dartmouth would allow him to rise above the problems that his parents faced. The friends he could make there, the connections he could achieve, and the things he could learn would allow him to make a name for himself. Carter had often thought he could use his gifts to enter politics, maybe even some kind of job with the embassy, but without connections and proper schooling, he couldn't hope to achieve any of those things. Politics was likely already closed to someone without means, but there were ways that he could work himself into such a position. It would take hard work and a lot of determination, but he could succeed on his own merits. Merits that would mean nothing if he didn't have the name of a prestigious school behind him. He closed his eyes as he lay across the picnic table, already contemplating the words the strange man had spoken to him the day before. "I'll be here if you change your mind." Carter tried to push the thoughts away, but he suspected that his mind might be wobbling on the subject. "Mr. Mason? Mr. Mason, your rebuttal." Carter shook himself, having been lost in his melancholy again. His teammates were looking at him, waiting for his flawless delivery, but his mind just wasn't in it. The auditorium wasn't full by any means, but the studious individuals who had come to see the semifinals were looking at him expectantly. He realized he was blowing this, about to blow his chances at the finals, and forced his mind to settle on his counterpoint. The correlation between wealth and success is inseparable. The idea that someone of the working class can obtain financial stability through hard work is a pipe dream. The days when someone can simply work hard to succeed are beyond us. And without outside means of wealth, the working class must be comfortable under the heel of those with wealth and power. He couldn't help but look at David as he finished, and grinned when he rolled his eyes. David should be very familiar with the premise, though maybe not from the appropriate viewpoint they were supposed to be defending. Carter had stayed up late studying for this debate, and the sleep he had gotten was far from adequate. He kept going back to the coffee shop again and again, and the smiling man was always there in his dreams. In reality, he hadn't seen him in close to a week, but the man seemed to burn in his thoughts nonetheless. He haunted his dreams, his words haunting his waking hours, and Carter was becoming frustrated with his dangled offer, though no more frustrated than he was with himself for considering it. Yes, but what about the American dream? What about the hopes that someone can come here with nothing and gain success? The number of immigrants who come here and start successful businesses has never been higher. People with barely more than the clothes on their backs can be financially stable within a generation. People willing to put in the hard work often do succeed, and I believe that such disparities can be bridged through hard work and perseverance. Look at the fluctuating numbers of YouTube content creators, people who have taken an idea and made a living at it. Look at the number of banks ready to extend loans to small businesses. This is the land of opportunity, not a place where the rich eat the poor, his opponent rebutted. It was Carter's turn to roll his eyes. West Central must surely be hurting for debaters if they let this girl get to the semifinals. "Mr. Mason, your rebuttal?" "Why bother?" Carter asked, and he could hear Mr. Merkel suck his teeth from the front row. "My opponent clearly can't hear me from her mountain of idealism. Indeed, immigrants are no longer stoned when they come off the boat, but the argument was for the disparagement between the wealthy and the middle class, not the means to gain upward mobility. To say that a man who owns a restaurant or starts a YouTube channel is as comfortable as a man whose father's father bought oil stock is ridiculous. The opportunities held by the rich are as numerous as they are unknowable. You can look no further than the antics of our latest president, or Jeffrey Epstein. We live in a society where the rich do indeed eat the poor. They simply take small bites so we don't feel it as much. They whittle away at our time and our labors, and we are left with the scraps. To believe anything else is fantasy." The crowd clapped, but Mr. Merkel was shaking his head. Carter had pulled it out of the fire, but he was starting to lose some of his touch. "We're driving up this weekend. Dad's got some golf buddies in New Hampshire, and he wants to visit the country club while he's up there." Carter had been changing out of his gym clothes when he heard David talking loudly with a few of his friends. It had been a few days since the debate semifinals, and Carter hadn't been sleeping any better. They were getting their towels ready to shower, something he had done as quickly as he could, and talking about weekend plans as Carter slid back into his regular clothes. Carter's weekend plans mostly revolved around studying for the debate finals, but he felt pretty secure in his position as lead debater. His ears had pricked up when David said New Hampshire, though, and he leaned in a bit as he eavesdropped. "I didn't realize your dad was an alum," Roger said, he and Derek always moving around David like flies on crap. "Yeah, he doesn't like to brag about being from a prestigious school. He prefers to let his skills in the courtroom do the talking for him. Still, it'll really help my chances of breaking into politics with a name like Dartmouth behind me. Carter felt his blood run cold. Dartmouth? His Dartmouth? David would be going to the school that he'd wanted to go to for so long, while he was stuck at some college. Worse yet, with his parents' income, he'd be lucky to afford a state college or a community college. David was talking about taking in the sights while they were there, but Carter could barely hear him over the blood pounding in his ears. This wasn't fair. How the hell had David gotten into Dartmouth? His grades were usually barely above a B, and he struggled with anything that wasn't math or extracurricular activities. How would he manage to swing an invitation to a school like Dartmouth? With money. That's how. His dad was an alumni, something that would make David a legacy, and he had likely spread his money around and schmoozed the right people in order to get his idiot son into a school like Dartmouth. They all turned when Carter slammed his locker shut, but he didn't even notice. He had trig next, but he decided to skip it. He strolled right out the front doors and was heading to the coffee shop with strides full of confident rage. If that was the price, then he knew where to get the currency. He knew people too, after all. The man looked up as he entered, smiling like a shark seeing a school of fish. He was leaning in the same spot he had been, waiting for Carter, and the look on Michelle's face told him all he needed to know. Had he been coming back just to see if Carter would change his mind? Why did he care so much? Was Carter's schooling really that important to him? The man made a grisly guardian angel, but Carter supposed that beggars couldn't be choosers. "Why, Mr. Mason, what a delight it is to see you," the man said, holding out a coffee as though he'd expected the boy at 2 o'clock on a school day. Carter accepted the coffee and discovered it was as usual. Had Michelle told this guy, or had he remembered from only a single meeting? "What's so heavy on your mind that you would skip school and come to speak with me?" Carter nodded. Straight to business, then. "You said there was another way," Carter said, careful how he asked. "For me to go to school, I mean." "I did," the man said, taking a sip of his coffee. What did you mean?" "I run a business that trades in a very particular commodity. It's quite lucrative, especially among the wealthy. I deal in talent, Mr. Mason, and business has been so good that I'm considering branching out. We've had a few hiccups, of course, but I think we're ready to push on into other forms of talent acquisition. Your talent for debate is remarkable, and we would like to pay you for it." "I'm not sure I understand. You want to pay me for my talent?" "In the form of a scholarship. For your talent, we will give you a full ride to the school of your dreams. Think about it. A way to attend the school you've always wanted to, without having to place yourself in financial hardships. In 30 years, your own children could be attending as legacies when you use your connections to move mountains." Carter was thinking about it. It all seemed a little too good to be true. They wanted his talent, but what did that mean? They wanted him to speak on their behalf? They wanted him to use his debate skill for their company? Carter had heard of dodgy contracts, even seen a few, but this one seemed to benefit him more than was comfortable. How long would they need to use his talent? Was there a certain expectation? "All your questions and concerns are very normal, but I can assure you there are no hidden barbs. I've been paying people for their talent for a very long time, and I want to add yours to my growing collection. If you agree, then let's shake on it. Seal the deal, as it were." And with that, he extended a hand. Carter looked at the hand, but he didn't dare shake it. There was a trap hidden there, just below the surface, and it was one that had rows of teeth. Carter took a step away, backtracking as he kept the man with the extended hand in sight. The man's smile never wavered. "That's okay, sport. Think on it for a while. A deal like this comes around so infrequently, but don't wait too long, or it might just pass you by." The bell jingled behind him as he ran, but it wasn't the last Carter would see of that smiling devil. "Mr. Mason, your rebuttal." Carter looked at Mr. Markle owlishly, blinking as he tried to focus. This was the most important debate of his life, and he needed to be on his game. If he fumbled the ball here, he could kiss any hope of a scholarship goodbye. If he didn't go to state this year and do flashingly well, Dartmouth would be out of the cards forever. He needed to focus, but he was so tired. Carter hadn't slept well for the past 6 days. It had all caught up with him the day he ran from the coffee shop, and it buzzed in his head like bees in a hurricane. The acceptance letter, the debate, David, Dartmouth, the smiling man's offer, the whole of his life, and the needle that it balanced on. It was all slowly driving him mad, and it kept him from snatching more than a few hours of sleep at a time. He had tried everything from sleep aids to exercise, but every time he closed his eyes, it all just coursed through him like a whirlwind. At the center of that storm was the smiling stranger, and his face took up a lot of space within his anxious mind. As he stood there trying to come up with a response for medieval economics versus Depression-era economics, all he could hear was the wind whistling inside his skull. David grinned triumphantly, and with good reason. He had gotten the upper hand in the last 3 debates, and Carter knew it. Depression-era economics were sounder than medieval economics because they had more to do with a banking system that was less corrupt than banks in debt to the crown and church. Allowed to flower in a freer market, they had less constraints placed on them and were more fruitful than a market under the heel of a monarch. Yes, because a freer market really helped them when it came to the crash. The medieval market was also unpredictable, but I feel that the presence of a monarch often strengthened the economy through war and expansion, something a free market does not often benefit from. Check your facts, Davy. War is good for an economy built on industry, something the medieval market was not always known for. Everything from farmers to tailors benefit when a nation goes to war, while only the monarchs truly benefit from a war and a monarchy. I'll give you that, but the turbulent nature of the medieval environment gave the peasants more chances to thrive, whereas the so-called free market took advantage of the working class in ways that kept them poor and easily exploited. Carter had the argument, but it was like trying to grab something with a slippery hand. He would take hold of it, only for it to slide through his fingers as he tried to catch it. It would slip again and leave him stuttering. He had managed to take hold of something when the little bell rang on Mr. Merkel's desk, and he called time. "Boys, would you mind staying over?" he asked, as the others grabbed their bags and departed. Carter stood in a moody cloud as David shone resplendently. "Carter, you're a skilled debater, but you've been slipping lately. Your arguments are sound, but we need someone whose mind isn't going to slip at the wrong time. I'm recommending David to be our representative this year, but I would like the two of you to help craft his arguments. Perhaps without the fear of limits hanging overhead, you can accomplish something grand together." It all sounded like so much needless blah blah, and Carter nodded as he packed his things away. He was angry and embarrassed, and when he strode silently from the hall, he could feel David watching him go in all his smugness. He had won, he had bested his enemy, and now he had achieved what he always wanted. He had a clear playing field, and Carter would be resigned to mediocrity for all time. Well, maybe not, Carter thought. As his feet took him inexorably towards the coffee shop, he could already see the man as he sat by the window. He watched Carter approach, smiling in unknowing glee, and when Carter came through the door and approached him, he tried to look surprised to see him. The illusion wasn't there, however, and he just looked like a cat who spied a fat rat for his supper. "Deal," Carter said, extending his hand before he could think better of it. Deal? The man said, cocking his head as though he wasn't sure what he was agreeing to. I wish to make your deal. I will accept your scholarship for my talent. The hand shook only a little, and when the man extended his own and wrapped it in his cold embrace, Carter shuddered only a single time. There was a feeling in his throat then, and Carter felt his breath stick. Something was happening to him. Something was happening to his throat, and as it coursed over his tongue, he tasted putrescence in his mouth. It was as if he had regurgitated a rotten fish, and when he tried to gag, his mouth wouldn't obey. He was choking, his throat working, but nothing came out. Black spots appeared at the edges of his vision, and as he fell back and out of the stranger's grip, he heard Michelle call his name a single time. He woke up in the hospital. He woke up in a paper gown with an IV in his arm, and his mother dozing beside him. He tried to ask her what had happened, but as he opened his mouth, nothing came out. He reached for his throat, but it felt fine. He opened his mouth and turned to the nearby mirror, but everything appeared to be intact. His mother came awake as he checked his mouth and told him how happy she was that he was okay. You fainted at the jelly beans. No one knew what had happened, and that young girl behind the counter was very... But that was when she realized that he couldn't talk. 3 doctors and a score of professionals later, and no one seemed to be able to explain what had happened. All they knew was that Carter was now a mute for whatever reason, and it was likely to be for the rest of his life. An x-ray showed that his vocal cords had been damaged by something, and his tongue had been injured. No one could explain it. No one even ventured to guess, but Carter never spoke again. He was mute for the rest of his days, and he didn't remember the man until he got home and found the envelope on the counter with his name on it. The one from Libris Talent, extending him a full scholarship to the school of his choice. In exchange for your talent, take this chance to better yourself and to soar as high as you can in your current state. Yours, Mr. Sereph. It wasn't until then that Carter realized what he had meant. Carter's talent had been his debate skill, his eloquence, his way with words, and Mr. Sereph had taken it from him. He had taken his gift and left him with a Magi's gift, and now Carter would have to figure out how to use it. The next few months would be hard, but Carter would overcome them. He would spend the summer in physical therapy, and despite his mother's urgings, he would start school in the fall. He would go to Dartmouth. He would study whatever he damn well pleased, and that son of a bitch would foot the bill if he knew what was good for him. It was 2 years into his study of ancient history that he saw David again. It was 2 years before he discovered the other half of the puzzle. Carter was heading for his class when he happened past an open door and heard someone he had never expected to hear again. The dilemma of the pen being mightier than the sword is that while swords cut a man to death, a pen may cut a man's reputation to shreds as readily as it might cut his throat in the night. A pen may ruin a man in so many ways and never mark him physically. The sword may have the common decency to kill a man, but the pen will mortally wound a man for years to come. He stopped at the door and looked in to find David and another student engaged in a debate. He hadn't seen David since freshman orientation, and that had been a kindness. David had truly been his last great rival, and it shamed him for David to see him like this. He also couldn't stand the way David looked at him whenever they met. It was a knowing look, a knowing smile, and it reminded Carter of the man who had taken his talent from him. Now, as he listened to David shred his opponent with his argument, He realized what it had been for. The longer he listened, the more he heard his own words beneath the swaggering voice of David Brown. David looked up as the crowd clapped and noticed Carter for the first time. He smiled, and Carter realized who had bought the talent that it made it possible for him to go to Dartmouth. After all, had he not already known that money made the universe move? Had he not known that with wealth, anything was possible? It could get you into the halls of learning, catapult you into the most prestigious offices in the land, and even, it seems, silence your opponents and give you the words you couldn't find yourself. Carter hoped that David had paid a pretty penny for his silver tongue, because it had cost him so much in the long run. That's it, Maria. The camera loves you, baby. Maria smiled as she struck another pose. It was all a little fuzzy, the pills making it hard to focus, but she needed them more than the fame these days. The heady drug that was fame had stopped having the same effect on her as it had when she was 16. Not even the same rush they had held for her when she was in her mid-20s. And now, staying a little bit high was the only way she felt much of anything. She continued to strike poses long after the flash had stopped going off, and when someone touched her arm, she jumped like a scalded cat. It was Maurice, her manager, and he had that worried look he sometimes got. It was the look that asked her, in a loud and shaking voice, how much she'd had to drink today, or which one of the disreputable fellas she had purchased today's pills from. He was such a worrier, and it would have been heartwarming if it weren't so tiresome. There, ready for the next girl, Maria. Let me help you to your dressing room. She pulled gently out of his grasp, giving him a slightly lopsided smile. There's no need, Maurice. I can find it just fine. She took a step and immediately expelled that notion by tripping over a cord and going down on her face. Her hands immediately came up to said face, checking to make sure there hadn't been any damage. This was her livelihood, all she had left of her late-teen stardom, and if anything happened to it, she'd be sunk. Maurice was running to help her, but someone else was reaching down to offer her a hand. She accepted it gratefully until she realized that it belonged to Jewel. Are you okay, Miss Fontaine? It was a nasty spill. I wanted to make sure you were... I'm fine, Maria hissed at the girl, pulling away as she righted herself. Maurice, make sure the crewmen secure those power lines a little better. I could have broken my neck. Maurice hadn't even finished trying to appease her when she stormed off towards her dressing room. She could already hear the little bitch, Jennifer Jewel Santiago, telling him that she hoped Maria was all right. She was such a big fan, and she thought of her as an inspiration, and she couldn't imagine how she would feel if anything happened to her. The simpering little twit went on, but Maria was well versed in her games. She knew the little girl couldn't wait for something to happen to her. Then she'd have the stage, the covers, all of it to herself. She could pretend that she was a good girl while people were watching, but Maria knew how she must hate her behind the scenes. She knew because it was exactly how Maria hated her. She slammed the door to her dressing room and flopped down in her chair before the large mirror of her vanity. She looked at herself in the mirror, studying her topography as if she meant to commit it to memory. She was intimately familiar with every wrinkle and every blemish. She had studied every dimple, every pockmark, and thank God there were few of those. She could have drawn herself from memory, and though some people would call it vanity, Maria always thought of it as an interest in her career. Some women had something to fall back on, a talent or an interest, but all Maria had was her pretty face. Hadn't her mother told her so? Hadn't she watched her as she sat before a vanity much like this one, and told her daughter that all women really had in this world were their looks? Once your looks were gone, it didn't matter how bright or talented you were. Once your looks were gone, the world would turn its back on you. As all beautiful women know, came a voice from behind her, making her jump. Maria glanced into the mirror and saw a grinning corpse standing in the corner of her dressing room. It was dressed in a long, luxurious black suit, its hair slicked back over its very soft-looking forehead. Its smile was much too large, and Maria suddenly didn't want him to get too close. She thought maybe he might bite her. She hadn't thought something like that since she was a little girl, but she thought it now. "How did you get in here?" she breathed out, with a confidence she certainly didn't feel. "1,000 pardons, madam. I had inquired with your assistant where you might be found, and he told me to look for you here." Maria was unsure whether she believed him or not. Maurice, despite being a bit flighty at times, did not often invite strange men into her dressing room, at least not without telling her first. He especially didn't make a habit of doing it after being on set with her all morning. When had this fellow talked to him? Sometime in the early morning when they had first got there? During her only bathroom break about 3 hours ago? As she looked at him through the reflection of the mirror, she let her hands inch towards the heavy perfume bottle on her vanity, preparing to fling it at him if he came at her. "I don't make a habit of receiving people in my dressing room. I think I'd like you to leave and go make an appointment with Maurice, like people usually do." The man did not scuttle off like a kicked dog, as she had expected he would. His smile grew even wider as he leaned on a cane that she had up until then not noticed. He reminded her of the picture that she had seen in the Phantom of the Opera book that she had loved so much when she was young. He could have been a twin to the Phantom himself, his face looking like so much skin stretched over a skull. "Bad day on the set, eh?" he asked, taking a step out of the corner. Maria said nothing, just watched in the mirror as he leered at her through the glass. "It's a shame that someone of your talent has to look behind them for circling vultures. Like your understudy, Jewel. What's she plotting behind those kind eyes and empty platitudes?" Maria still wanted to yell at the man to get the hell out, but he was making quite a lot of sense. Maybe she wasn't the only one who had noticed the little bitch scheming. If others had come to see it, maybe it wasn't so crazy. If this man could see it too, maybe it was more than just her mind playing tricks on her. Of course, who could blame them? Her star is rising, while yours may be preparing to fall. She has youth on her side, something that is quickly slipping through your grasp. "What's your point?" Maria asked, still not trusting him, but willing to listen. "Only that I can offer you something that she cannot get at her current level of fame. I've come to offer my services, perhaps to help you in some way." Maria had suspected as much. He was here to sell something. He wouldn't be the first to come and try to tempt her with beauty products and snake oil. He seemed less sinister now, more something she was familiar with, and when she turned around to look at him, she let go of the perfume bottle. People who wanted to show you things, as a rule, did not try to kill you. "Now, I'm very certain that I want you out. I have several contracts with several different skincare companies. I'm not open to trying out some strange beauty product that is more likely to ruin my skincare routine than benefit it. Now go, before I call the—" She stopped suddenly when he pulled the bottle out of his coat pocket. It was like nothing that she had ever seen, and it would have looked right at home on the desk of some alchemist. The bottle was like gemstone, holding facets and pools that made its depth shine. The liquid was the color of caramelized whiskey, and despite being absolutely still, it seemed to move as if constantly being pulled by some tidal force. "It's beautiful," she said, surprised by her own words. "It's the secret to what you're looking for. A single drop will renew what you've lost. But you have to drink that drop every day." Part of her wanted to deny it, and part of her wanted to ask how that could be. But the only thing that came out was a little of both. How is that possible? It's an industry secret, the skeletal man told her. The real question is whether you will accept it or not. Now some of the old doubt had begun to return, and Maria wasn't entirely sure she wanted to take the stranger at his word. Just like before, though, it was as if he could read her mind. I see a demonstration is in order. He removed the tip of the crystalline vessel, revealing an equally delicate-looking dropper. He squeezed a single drop into it, pulled it out as he offered it to her. The liquid set within the dropper, new life waiting to begin, and Maria found that she wanted it. She was hungry for what lay within that dropper. A single drop, he reminded her. That's all you need. He held it out, tempting to drop it onto the edge of the precipice, and Maria found herself leaning forward as she opened her mouth to receive it. The single drop hit her tongue like a bomb, and she coughed as the sour taste of corruption passed down her throat. It wasn't just her tongue, however. She felt a kind of tightening on her skin. She had wanted to cry out, to ask this man why he had poisoned her, but instead she was left speechless as the corruption did its work. It felt as if someone had cranked her flesh to the ripping point, and when she sat back hard against the vanity, she heard the rattle of bottles. She turned, expecting to see her face purpling in the mirror, but as she watched, her body shed 15 years in seconds. Suddenly, she was 16 again, her skin as smooth and fresh as it had been on that long-ago day. She marveled at what she saw, but she knew even then that she would have to have more. Wondrous, isn't it? You're one of the few who can actually watch it happen without losing some grip on your mind. I've known people who don't come back from that first enticing drop. As she touched her face, Maria had only one question. How much? The man smiled. Fortunately for you, you have the kind of wealth to afford this sort of extravagance that I offer. The price is on the back of this business card, as is the number you will need to order more. Once you've started, you will want to continue. She took the card and looked at the number, narrowing her eyes a little at the back side of it. The number was high, but not enough to dissuade her. She could pay it. She could pay it 1,000 times over, and she flipped it over to see the name on the other side. If she was going to be doing business with this man, she wanted to know his name, and what a name it turned out to be. Richard T. Sereph was a name she would come to cherish and despise as time went on. Maria looked into the mirror as the drop fell onto her tongue. She had watched it happen 1,000 times before, maybe even 100,000, but she never grew tired of watching herself de-age. She had become something of an anomaly in the modeling world, and at this rate, she could continue on well into her 50s. As her skin returned to the same rosy smoothness it had held when she was 16, Maria smiled. She would be 42 this year, but you'd never know it. Before she turned away, she had to squint at something she almost thought she'd seen. It almost looked like someone was in the bathroom with her, but that was impossible. She had checked to make sure the bathroom was empty before she came in. No one had come in since, but it wasn't the first time she had caught something out of the corner of her eye. Over the years, she constantly saw things, especially when she was at her vanity. They were usually gone when she looked up, but it was hard to shake the feeling that she wasn't alone sometimes. It hardly mattered, she thought. She slid the bottle back into her purse. The drops beat the pills and the booze for hallucinations any day of the week, anyway. The little vial held enough of the precious liquid for 5 years, and the price for them was becoming quite dear. Had she really looked at that first number and thought it was large? Now she paid 5 times as much for the bottle she held. Soon it would be 5 times that, if she kept on like this. Beauty had become a drug for her, and she found that it was addictive. Not long until she'd have to recreate herself and come up with a different name. Would she be her granddaughter? Maybe a niece? It didn't matter. Maria wasn't as addicted to modeling as she was to the wonderful liquid in that glass bottle. She was returning to the party, the one they were holding in celebration of her 41st birthday, but she bumped into a familiar face on the way out of the women's room. She mumbled something about being more careful, but that's when she saw the girl. "Miss Fontaine, it's so nice to see you. How long has it been?" Maria put on her best fake smile as she greeted the rival from her past. "Jewel, I haven't seen you in years. How have you been?" Not good, Maria would guess. While Maria's star had been rising, Jennifer Santiago's had fallen like a comet. The poor girl was still modeling, still getting her name out there, but her 5 minutes of fame had been fleeting indeed. When the first drop of that scrumptious liquid had hit Maria's tongue, the girl's name had been on the lips of anyone in the industry. They had expected she would go far, a name that would launch clothing lines and sell fragrances for decades to come. But it had fizzled instead a few years later. Some of that had been thanks to the resurgence of Maria's career, but most of it was just simple luck and politics. The girl's agent hadn't been quite as talented as Maurice. Few of them were, and she'd fallen into obscurity after a short stint in notoriety. Maurice. Another person Maria hadn't thought about in a while. It really had been a shame to lose his amazing business acumen, but the heart attack that had killed him a few years ago hadn't exactly asked for permission. "Yes," Jewel said in a slight stutter. It's been a rough couple of years. I see you're doing well, though, looking as good as always." Maria smiled. She knew it was so, but it was always nice to hear people tell her. "Well, it's been great catching up, but I have to get back to my party. Why don't you come down to Raltz's studio tomorrow? I'll put in a good word for you. Perhaps he needs some background models or something." She finished as she set the barb. "How do you do it?" Maria stopped when Jewel asked the question, her feet suddenly frozen like ice. "Pardon? How do you do it? How do you look the same after 20 years of doing this?" Maria started to tell the girl it was none of her business, but decided to give her the usual response. "Just my usual skincare routine, exercise, and a lot of leafy greens and my..." When Jewel rounded on her, her face looked furious. The girl was only 26, she had no right to look so haggard, but perhaps when the work dried up, she hadn't been able to maintain her level of commitment to the lifestyle. Lack a proper diet, having to live like a normal person, maybe partying it up while she had the funds to do so. It all took a toll, and now she was reaping the consequences. She was old before her time, and unless she could scrabble up the money to pay Mr. Sereph, she'd stay old forever. "Cut the crap. I know there's something secret that you used to stay young. The day I saw you, you looked 31. The next time I saw you, you looked even younger than that. How do you do it? How does it work? I have to have it. I have to have it. I have to..." As she'd been talking, she'd been getting closer to Maria. Her hands had become claws as she grabbed for her, latching onto her bag instead. Maria yelled for help, trying to push the girl away as the two fought, but when her expensive bag came tumbling off the shoulder, Maria heard the shattering glass. She was suddenly as furious as her attacker. She had just purchased that bottle, and it had not come cheaply. This girl, this broke bitch, probably didn't have enough money in her bank account for a taste, let alone what had been in that bottle. Now she was going to have to go back to Mr. Sereph and tell him how she needed another bottle of this miracle liquid. She would tell him, and he would smile. Then he would hand her a number on the back of the card, and she would pay it, no matter how much it was. If she had to prostitute herself on the street corner to buy another drop of youth, she would pay it gladly. The wait staff pulled Jewel off of her, but the damage was already done. Maria grabbed her bag to make sure, but she already knew what the sound was. The bottle was nothing but broken glass inside her bag, but the inside was dry as a desert. Whatever the liquid wasn't normal. Maria didn't really care much for the chemical makeup, though, as she pushed past her friends, made a running gait for the street. She only knew that she wanted more. "You don't understand. It wasn't my fault. It was some flighty little bitch who just had to." The man's voice was crude oil and snake scales as he spoke to her over the phone, and she knew the smile running over his face like mouse feet. "My dear Maria, I don't care if King Kong descended from the Empire State Building and crushed you and your bottle flat on Fifth Avenue. The bottle is broken, and you need more. Then I will sell it to you. The price, however, will be steep." Maria nodded into the phone, having known it would be. It would be expensive, and Maria had expected that there would be no way that she could get recompense from Jennifer Santiago's estate for her damaged goods. What would she put on a property form? Bottle full of magic liquid that makes me 16 forever? They would laugh at her, and the price tag. No, Maria already knew that she would be out of pocket for this one, and this one was going to hurt her. "Tell you what I'll do," Mr. Sereph oiled. "I'll give you a new bottle at the cost of the old bottle. Call it a little generosity for a returning client. This, however, is a one-time thing. Don't expect this kind of kindness every time you have a little accident." Maria thanked him big. The price he was asking was still extremely high, but it was better than 5 times that cost. Mr. Sereph could talk about kindness all he wanted, but he knew that she'd be back anyway. He had her hooked, and he knew that she needed what he had. She would pay whatever he asked, until whatever he asked might be too much for even her rising star. She would have to be more careful with these bottles from now on. The new bottle had been on her vanity when she got back from the photo shoot the next day. Good thing, too, because Maria had already begun to notice the effects of not having it. Her skin just felt looser. Her energy wasn't there today, and she had gone out during the morning break and done something she hadn't done in a long time. Joel had still been pushing his so-called pretty pills, though Maria was pretty sure they were a little more than garden variety amphetamines. She hadn't touched the stuff in years, but she really needed them to go through the day today. She had performed in a fog, nowhere near up to her usual standards, when she got back to her dressing room after a long day of playing dress-up. She was rapturous at the sight of that beautiful little bottle. She took one immediately, the liquid dropping on her tongue as easily as it had the first time, and she watched as her beauty returned. She had once found the process a little dizzying, but now it came only with a sense of exhilaration. The day had aged her, and she looked 40 by the time she had come stumbling off the set. But now, everything was right again, and she, the creature standing in the corner behind her, made her scream in terror. It wasn't the bony and off-putting Mr. Sereph this time. It was a shadowy woman with living coals for eyes. She had leaned against the junction of the room, and her fingertips seemed to stretch across the walls as she prepared to spring. The woman's shadowy hair was thick and luxurious, falling around her like a cloak of smog, and as she came flying towards the vanity, Maria fell to the side and covered herself with her hands as she lay in a ball. She expected to be attacked, to be scratched or bitten, but when nothing happened after 30 seconds of cowering, she opened her eyes to find no one but herself in the dressing room. Mr. Sereph picked up on the second ring and sounded surprised to hear from her. "Don't tell me you need another bottle already. I can assure you that the deal won't be as good. For this, what exactly did you give me?" He was silent for a few seconds, clearly not used to being spoken to in such a way. "Why, the same thing I've given you twice before. Is something wrong with it?" A shadow person tried to attack me while I was looking in the mirror. I'd say that's something wrong with it. His next question left her speechless. Has that never happened before? I've been told they can be a little upsetting. What do you mean? She breathed after some contemplation. Did you think the liquid wouldn't come with a price? The others report seeing them right away. I'm surprised it took you this long. Maria felt her breath hang a little as his words cascaded over her. Others? Mr. Sereph surprised her when his laugh rolled out like an excited wave. Did you think you were the only one? Did you think you were special? In another life, you would have been one of those shadows you see in the mirror. But no, you have wealth and privilege, so you may continue to shine. Maria was dumbfounded, trying to find words, but unable. The shades were like her. They were the shadows of those who had come before her. She didn't understand at all, but she understood enough. The bottle was filled with their beauty, their life, and she was taking it to keep herself young. She looked back at the mirror, and there was the fiery-eyed shade standing right behind her. She was smog, angry smoke in motion, and Maria saw that her hands were balled at her side. She was familiar somehow. She was someone Maria knew. Maria couldn't prove it, but she felt sure that it was Jewel. She had failed to rise, failed to come back, and now she wanted to know how Maria had kept her beauty. Jewel had wanted to know bad enough to seek out the mysterious Mr. Sereph, and now she knew all too well the source of Maria's power. Her power and her vanity. Maria leaned her head against the glass, watching the fiery woman as she moved within the mirror. Maria felt tears slide down her face as she realized that despite this knowledge, she wouldn't stop. She would go back to the bottle again and again, because the alternative was watching herself turn old before her very eyes, and that would be a hell too much for her. Youth had become her drug, and the high was more heady than any pill or potion she had ever taken. Maria wondered if she would be a shadow in the mirror one day. Maybe when she couldn't afford the magical liquid, she would find out what became of those lost beauties once their youth was all used up.